Hello, and welcome to Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project, an initiative by the Bangladesh Feminist Archives. My name is Tanveer Anoy. I'm an academic, author, archivist, and activist, and I am very honored to host today's conversation. This series is dedicated to preserving the voices of feminists who have shaped and continue to shape feminist and social movements in Bangladesh and beyond. Through these interviews, we aim to document their journeys, amplifying their contributions, and inspire future generations. For this episode, we're excited to feature Mitul Mahmud, a passionate advocate for gender equality and social justice. Mitul is currently serving as a equity, diversity, and inclusion strategist at a Canadian nonprofit. She is also the co-founder of Swayong, a human rights organization that addresses social justice issues by amplifying real-life stories. Mitul's social justice work spans multiple countries, where she has led impactful initiatives to challenge gender-based violence and promote equity. With a strong commitment to community-driven solutions, Mitul's advocacy and policy work continue to create meaningful change. Today, we will explore her journey, her thoughts on gender equality, and her vision for social justice. Mitul, let's start with your journey. What first inspired you to become an advocate for gender equality and social justice?
First of all, thank you, Anoy, for the wonderful, wonderful introduction. I hope I'm worthy of all the things that you've just mentioned. And thank you for this opportunity to be present and have this conversation with you. When you ask about what inspired me, I feel like I have one of the most uninteresting or unexciting stories of origin in this situation because growing up, I actually rarely witnessed any form of gender discrimination in my own family. Like my mother was a very successful working professional. My aunt was a very successful working professional. We're a household of two sisters, so there wasn't even a brother to compare ourselves to. So there was never any special talk in the house about being a girl or what that means. But at the same time, when people would ask us, right, is, oh, you're just two sisters, you don't have a brother. Or comments like where they would tell my father or tell my parents that, oh, you've got such successful daughters, you must be really proud. They're kind of like your sons. And I've always just seen my parents really fight back on those comments where they're like, no, they're not our sons, they're our daughters, they're our girls. And so I just naturally grew up with, I think, very feminist attitudes. But I just think I just didn't have the words for them, right? I didn't have the vocabulary for what I felt and who I was at that time. So naturally, organically, it just kind of stayed in me and I embraced that. Uh, though as an adult, I've had some experiences of abuse. I've had experiences of abuse in public places and private places, in private spaces. And all of those just further motivated me to raise awareness and take action. And I felt like I was coming from a place of privilege where I had first hadn't knowledge of what it can look like in the microcosm of my own family, just beyond in our own household. So as I experienced the firsthand impact of like the devastating impact of gender-based violence and gender discrimination, I just grew more and more committed to become an advocate myself. And gender equality and social justice became my calling as I learned more about the systemic barriers and how much colonial trauma we're all still collectively carrying, especially traditionally marginalized groups, both in Bangladesh and across the world. So all of those combined is what made me an advocate for gender equality, social justice, and all of those.
Thank you so much, Mitul. That was a really, really lovely answer. Can you share any formative moments or experiences that shaped your feminist perspective and commitment to this work?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, right? It's very hard for me to point out any moments as such because it was so natural and organic for me. I've always had a very strong sense of justice and fairness, and I knew that, and which is what led me to actually go to law school. I ended up getting a law degree. And it was during law school, as I think the youngest when I can go back, is when we learned about feminist theories and feminist pedagogies and feminist movements. That's when I felt like I finally found the words to put to my own thoughts and feelings, things that I'd always kind of known in my head, but didn't know how to articulate. So I really remember, even when I close my eyes, I can see my notes, on the different stages and phases of feminism and all those things, because they were so integral to my journey into joining this movement. So it was then really that I embraced and started practicing feminism in that scientific sense of the word. And I embraced it personally, I embraced it professionally, I embraced it academically, where I really delved into learning further, and even artistically, where I found myself drawn to feminist theater and feminist performances. And I even participated in many of that. So I think the work that I've also done in Bangladesh, particularly in rural areas, just made me realize how deeply ingrained patriarchy can be, and it is currently, and how urgent it is that we need to change these structures. So, and interacting with grassroots activists and hearing their stories of resilience, and courage in both, like honestly, in both Bangladesh and now that I work in Canada, wherever I go, has only just further strengthened my belief and in the power of feminism and in the power of feminist activism.
Thank you so much, Mitul. My next question would be, how has your personal journey intersected with the causes and the communities you work with?
That's an interesting question because I always want to recognize, despite being a woman of color and despite being a woman in Bangladesh, which can immediately just mean second-class citizens, I still have to recognize my privileges. So some of the work that I do has been within the communities that I had around me, but it has also pushed me. My journey has been a lot about pushing me outside of my little privileged bubble and working with different intersectionalities. And my own experience of abuse, for example, has made me recognize the necessity of like gender-based, like eradicating gender-based violence, which cannot just be this abstract idea, something that happens to our neighbors, something that we kind of sort of know somebody has gone through, but it was something that finally became deeply personal and transformative. So, and I definitely carry that in my work, and it shows that the lessons from that experience, the growth and the healing that had to happen because and despite of that experience is something that I don't think I can separate from my cause. Or like when I reach out to communities, like for example, my one of the first things I did when I came to Canada was leading a research project about gender-based violence experiences among racialized Muslim women in the region that I live in. So I really always carry that experience and my personal intersections with feminism with me. Secondly, through my work with Swayong and other community-based organizations, right? I've had the privilege to provide a platform for amplifying voices which were once silenced. And even though I never really felt that I was being silenced by the powers that may be, but maybe I was silencing myself because of my own internalized patriarchy, because of my own internalized ideas that I'd grown up and my conditioning. So when I say that I want to provide a platform to amplify voices, once again, it's an intersectionality of my own experience navigating this world with all my identities. And that has definitely led to the causes I choose to focus on and the communities that I choose to work with. So I think the intersectionality of my own identity as a woman of color, a survivor, and an advocate, it really allows me to connect deeply with communities in both Bangladesh and Canada. And I take that as a huge privilege as well as maybe a burden that I carry in my work and in my life.
Thank you. That was a really, really, really deep and meaningful answer. And I really, really appreciate whatever you're doing, Mitul. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, speaking of Swayong, right? So you co-founded Swayong, a human rights organization focused on amplifying real life stories. So what inspired you to create this platform, and how does storytelling contribute to social justice?
Thinking about, I think working kind of, Shayong has been really the brainchild of my sister and I because we had gotten very tired of looking around, looking in the media, right? Movies, doesn't matter from where, and reading books, and none of that captured the women that I know in my life, the women that I've had the pleasure and the privilege of working with, of working side, beside. And that has been, I think, a gap that kind of ate at my head and my sister's head for the longest time. So we were like, and no matter what book we read, we never saw my mom in that, right? Or my aunt in that, or the friends that we have, some of our mutual friends that we know, Anoy, they were never represented. They were never reflected in those characters. And I think before even I go into like why I did what I did, thank you to you. I think that through your literature that you've given us some of that, like you've bridged that gap as well. So thank you for your storytelling. But I think for us, it was really because we were both, we'd worked in the nonprofit sector, we'd worked in the gender sector in Bangladesh at that point for a very long time. And the numbers weren't just doing it, right? Like you saw recently that I think it was UNICEF that posted about 51% of girl children in Bangladesh are married off before the age of whatever, and the pushback on that. So that's when I think those kinds of things also made us realize that just numbers and bullet points and graphs and charts aren't going to really make radical change. And when I say radical change is when we're trying to uproot what exists and change it from the bottom up. For me, I think the biggest power lies in people's stories. And when you turn those numbers and graphs and charts and statistics into a human name, into somebody that you may even know, maybe somebody shares that name, like with somebody else who's close to you, that touches you at a level, and the impact of that is going to be significantly different than just knowing, oh, 51%. So I think that was the driving force behind Shoyong. And you asked about the work with social justice. So we started with that, and then we did work with gender diverse communities. We worked with indigenous communities. So then Shoyong slowly became a platform to tell your story, regardless of your identity, regardless of how many identities you come with, where you come from, who you are. So yeah, the impact on social justice for us is that we've empowered individual voices that have now have attained the potential of becoming a very powerful collective. So yeah, that's kind of like and using storytelling has been our big focus just because of that, is that we have humanized crisis, we've humanized conflict, we've humanized these egregious offenses that happen against women, and we've put a name and a face and somebody's actual story with it. And that impact that we have seen has been tremendous. And it goes both ways. The impact on the listener, the impact on the person, reading our stories is one, but also the impact on the person sharing is that they've finally, maybe they've struggled with that story because they've been holding it inside for so long, and to be able to safely share that story that was just bottled up inside them has also been so freeing. And we've had so many conversations with our storytellers, as we call them, that how much lighter and how much more empowered they feel by having shared that story. So let's hope that eventually leads to social justice and something about social justice. But like most of what I have done in the past and continue to do so, most of those aren't solved and probably won't be solved in, yours or mine or our listeners' lifetime. But we continue to do the work.
Thank you so much, Mitul. And also thank you so much for the shout out. And I'm really, 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 honored. But let me tell you one thing is that I really, really appreciate whatever Shine is doing. And also the power of storytelling. All the time we kind of like dismiss storytelling as a literature fiction type situation or system. So we do not kind of appreciate in our real lives, experiences. And kind of like Shoyong putting real life stories as point as storytelling. That was a really, really great move and also courageous move to kind of like put people to come together and like show that like storytelling can happen in non-fiction way as well, right? Like it
And
doesn't
I
have to be fiction.
Yes, and that takes me back as well now that I'm based in Canada, right? When I learn about the Indigenous communities here and the Indigenous ways of being, the Indigenous ways of learning, I am even more familiar with how so many cultures before our entire global colonial history was based off of storytelling, right? That's how they learned. That's how they communicated. That's how they passed on knowledge. And somehow, during the course of white colonialism, we've forgotten those things. We've forgotten how to tell stories. We've forgotten how to learn from stories, stories that were passed on from generations, right? Like think about the stories that we grew up with, the the Raja who had three daughters, right? And who loved him as much as salt story, and all of those other stories that really were built to teach us something. And we've kind of along the way lost that. And I hope that through Shayong and through your work with your, literature and your, uh, books and all that you do, we collectively kind of go back to that a little bit. Because clearly, like talking to your community, sitting down in a circle and sharing stories is as old as time.
Yeah, and also non-structure. Like I think storytelling is also a very great, I would say, strong decolonial tool to also to kind of like show people that like storytelling doesn't have to be like in a certain structure or
In
certain
a
way.
format. Yeah,
Format,
exactly.
right? Even like breaking those barriers, it doesn't have to be instructed. And I have seen in Showing, I also have published in Showing's blog. So see, like I didn't feel any kind of like, that structured way I really have to like to write what I have to write in, other newspapers and other established, I would say, writing platforms. So giving a platform like this, like you can be yourself, you can write whatever you want to write, express yourself by writing. That really, really Shoyang really, really did great job to doing that. And I'm so proud that like Shoyang has collected so many intersectional diversified stories that we can go back and see that see storytelling, this decolonizing tool can also very much helpful like to make it very much diversified. Okay, Mitul. So my next question for you is that so what has been the impact of Shoyong's initiatives in addressing social justice issues, particularly around gender equality? So how do you see storytelling as a tool for empowering marginalized voices and driving systemic change?
I think we would like to believe that at Shayong that we've successfully raised awareness on many issues that were otherwise very taboo and usually not talked about, very stigmatized. So we've definitely raised voices, not just ourselves, like not just my voice, which already had its platform, but like other people's voices that were being silenced on gender-based violence, unequal access to resources, gender discrimination, indigenous land rights, gender diverse groups, right? Our queer community and their rights and their stories. So this platform really has allowed women and women identifying and other gender diverse people to share their stories. So I think that's also the impact, the biggest impact is giving people their power. Like the thing is, when I say that, I feel really terrible, like as if I had their power to begin with. Like who am I to give them their power? But I think it's them coming to terms with their internal power and acting on it and acting from it is something that is a huge impact, like on a personal level. And on a more systemic level, I think Swayong has also sparked a lot of dialogue at both grassroots level and within like policymakers, right? Because we have been part of, Swayong was one of the founding members of Feminists Across Generations, where we hosted a lot of protests. It was a very systemic protest against the rape culture, the pervasive rape culture of Bangladesh. So, and our the demands that we collectively came up with from Feminists Across Generation, or FemGen, as a lot of people would know it, is something that went to the parliament. It was presented in the parliament. So I think a lot of Swayong's work is started with grassroots activism, and now we've had impact at a policy level. Me, myself, as somebody who also works as a feminist activist professionally as a job as well, at my various other roles, I have seen this storytelling tool and the impact of this has worked tremendously with grassroots activism, but also at policy level. And that's where we mean like the social justice impact of storytelling can be so far reaching and wide in addressing systemic challenges. So we've also helped create connections between communities as well, communities that didn't think that they didn't know that they had this common ground or this common fight. So we were also able to kind of bridge those gaps through our platform and through our work. And we've had individuals share and identify their needs, their desires, their visions for a better future. And that can go from somebody who's very knowledgeable to, like, for example, working with Shirinapa, to somebody who's just working in the remote hill tract somewhere. And so I think just bridging the gaps between those two things, those two groups of people and those two communities has also been a huge impact of Swayong's challenging the systemic structures in place. So we've also, I think, one last thing I want to say about Swayong's impact is how storytelling builds resilience and resistance. Is the moment that you are not being able to be silenced anymore. You're not a silent participant in patriarchy or in social injustice anymore. We can really shift the cultural and political conversation and the narrative around gender and justice. And all of this collectively, again, fingers crossed, will lead to systemic change.
Absolutely. Like unstructured storytelling always work, right? Like I really do feel like whenever you put storytelling in a structured way, it always feel that like you have to like to be, like a sane person, or like you have to be, like this whole formalities and stuff as well.
No,
But but
it's your story. You say it
yeah.
how you want to say it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's my story. I really want to like to tell my story in my own language, in own my accent, it with own my words, okay?
Yeah.
So I don't have to like to surrender to myself to some sort of like systemic bureaucracy and kind of like made myself like, that like I have to like
Yeah.
to fit in a structure. I have to fit my story. My story will be accepted if I do fit into the stereotypical social structure, right? So this
That
is,
reminds me that,
yeah,
the way that you're saying that storytelling works, it also just throws cultural bourgeois out of the window.
absolutely, yes. Yeah,
We're like, what is this elitism in, like,
yeah,
oh, there has to be this, there has to be that.
yeah,
I don't care. My story is not
yeah,
for you. I'm sharing it for me,
mm,
right? And shifting that narrative, it
yeah.
really, like, the power imbalance, the power dynamics get completely shifted when we look
Mm.
at it like that.
Yeah. So as I also like collect stories. So whenever I kind of like talk with a lot of folks, people say like, "Oh, I do not talk very formally. I really do not. My thoughts are very, very fragmented. Like it's not very much jointed." I was like, like your fragmented thoughts are also thoughts. Your story is your story. It doesn't have to be, a beginning or end or whatever the structure is available there, right? So I really do think like breaking those stereotypes, breaking those structures, I really do appreciate Shoyang and feminists like you to encouraging us to to tell our stories in our own way. Thank you, Mitul. Um, let's talk about your work again. So
Yeah,
your work spans several countries and involves diverse communities. How has this global perspective influenced your approach to advocacy and social justice?
I think just working in both Bangladesh, Canada, and I've also traveled and worked in some other places has really highlighted the global and the localized challenges of gender-based inequality for me. And I really want to emphasize that while the struggles may differ, the fight for equality is universal. There's no difference in like the sense of justice, the sense of inequalities, and how that affects groups of marginalized people. That that looks exactly the same. The factors might be a little different, and maybe the structures and the struggles are slightly different, but the fight remains universal. So I think the global perspective, though, because I've worked in so many different communities now, has made me more malleable, more adaptable, where I think it's opened up maybe some brain neurons in me where I can now learn from different contexts and then I can apply them in a different context, in a very more culturally and contextually sensitized manner, because even my own thoughts and understanding aren't so homogenous anymore, right? It's now become this amalgamation. So that really shows in my work where I would take a lesson learned in a community and now I'm able to identify another completely different community. But like, how can I tweak that now? So I feel like I and my own thoughts have also become very adaptable and they've learned to become flexible. But it's also taught me that in social justice work, one size does not fit all, right? Each community, each group has a very unique approach, unique knowledge, unique set of circumstances that needs to acknowledge their local histories, their local, their community values, and their own unique challenges. I think in this gender equality fight in the world, sometimes we get lost in local problems but global solutions. And that doesn't necessarily work because those global solutions need to be localized before they can be implemented or they can be put into action in a more community-based situation. So despite I think that all like learning and navigating those things and even like in my head debating what'll work here. Oh, this worked in Germany, that doesn't mean this will work in Canada even. So just taking all that homogeneity outside and really learning to tailor and customize and contextualize solutions. I would think, well, I just mentioned right earlier about my research with racialized Muslim women. If you think about it, aren't a lot of Bangladeshi women are technically racialized Muslim women, but at the same time, they're marginalized, but they're also not a part of systemic minority, right, in Bangladesh. So I cannot take the experiences of a Bangladeshi woman in Bangladesh experiencing domestic violence and exactly apply that in the Canadian situation. So even though this person actually may have just moved from Bangladesh or India or Pakistan, but their experiences of domestic violence vary significantly based on where they are. And sometimes I've also learned that those problems may persist within the communities. The I think the irony for me and a big lesson learned was sometimes those communities actually suffer more deeply in situations where they're further marginalized, right? Like, yes, being in Bangladesh, being a woman and being a victim and survivor of domestic violence is one thing. But when that happens to you in another country where you are even further marginalized and more vulnerable because of who you are and what you look like and where you come from, then that really adds on to the layers. So I think my work at this point in my life, all I can tell you is that I really just appreciate intersectionality a lot more than I ever could have. Because it's not just academic, it's not just theoretical anymore. I'm having to actually implement those and plan those interventions here now, having worked in Bangladesh all my life. That I think has to be the biggest way that it's influenced my approach to advocacy and my approach to even the words I use for social justice. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that you're really really fine. No need to worry. So it really really makes sense. Okay, Mitul. So through your work, you have challenged gender-based violence and inequity. What are some of the key challenges you have faced and how you have addressed them?
Thank you for this. This question really made me think about the challenges. Like I said, I'm always so caught up in acknowledging my privileges that sometimes I tend to maybe undermine some of the challenges because I feel guilty for thinking of them as challenges because I shouldn't be. But then that also makes me think, but that's my experience. Like that's me navigating life, and I've experienced those as well, despite my many privileges, if there are. So I'm very conscious of when I speak about challenges that I'm being very mindful, and it comes from a place of authentic lived experience and not just something that's coming from a place of internalized and conditioning that I've grown with and internalized ideas that I've grown with. So I think one of the biggest challenges when I talk about challenges is me, myself, my head, my embraced internalized patriarchy, my own notions of what to be a woman, how to be a woman, and challenging those and dismantling those within myself first before I can authentically show up to do my work, I think has to have been one of the key challenges. Like I said, like I myself was, I'm a survivor of a very extremely abusive marriage. But how could that have been, right? Like when I reflect on that retrospectively, is that, oh, you would wonder, and most people would say, but you are a gender activist, you fight for these things. How did you let it happen to you? Right? That the onus becomes like it was the burden on me that like somehow I let it happen to me. And not that it was done to me, but like I allowed it for it to happen. And when I really reflect on those kind of things, I think the biggest challenge that I had to overcome at the time, and I reflected on afterwards, is just my ideas of what voicing it looks like, what an idea of how a woman shares it, my professional versus my personal. Like, will this hurt my credibility as a gender activist if it were to happen to me? And like really re-narrating that to myself is that no, it doesn't hurt my credibility. It gives me more power to speak about it because now I can say I went through it. So, and so that I think is like a big one where the intersection of that personal and professional challenges has then have now become a source of strength in many ways and a source of skill for me, is where I've had to navigate the emotional toll of reliving some of my own painful experiences while remaining committed to my advocacy and my social justice work. And so that's like from a very personal way of doing things. But also when I look at things socially in Bangladesh specifically, many communities, right? Many. And I'm not just saying just women or no, just anybody who's systemically marginalized, they face cultural resistance and stigma and taboo when it comes to challenging any set social norms, right? Specifically, we know what happens when people question gender norms, which can make advocacy extremely difficult. That does make it seem like sometimes I'm just barking up a wall, like I'm trying to talk to a wall about this. So there's definitely been many, many moments, several times in my life where I've had that feeling and I've really felt very stuck. And I've tried to address it in many situations by engaging in dialogues, trying to like emphasize the empathy, the humanity, and the common grounds that can be built. And a big one, my background is also sort of in education. I worked in the education sector a little bit, where now when I do the work, I feel like sometimes a lot of this hate, a lot of this hostility is coming from a place of unintentional ignorance. So I now value first educating and equipping and seeking to understand before I seek to be understood. So that's also definitely improved my collaboration. So some of those challenges have been, I think I've gotten better, or it's become easier to deal with when I've learned those skills to navigate these difficult spaces. And a significant challenge is definitely, we cannot forget, like all these abstract things set aside, A big one is the complexity of policy implementation. Take Bangladesh, Canada, whatever country you want to pick, policy implementation is a big challenge in our advocacy work. Is sometimes we have these amazing drafts and white papers and all these papers, but when it comes to actual implementation in the field, in the ground, in the communities, that's where sometimes they fall short. So where systemic barriers actually, that's when they impede progress. It's no longer in the hands of a few people, but now it's the structure in place in itself that's a big barrier. And I think a solution to that has been getting this buy-in, like inviting them to be your stakeholders, really allows them to think that they have a stake in this, and empowering local leaders, localized and local leaders and stakeholders to also ensure that advocacy efforts are sustainable. I cannot myself be doing that. It's not also sustainable to think that one Mitul can do this for however long. So I think you need to expand your stakeholder base and have them also fight for or demand proper policy implementation, and get the policymakers to see, build that case for them and invite them to be an active participant in this, so that they're not implementing Mitul's policy, they're implementing they have an ownership in this, they have a stake in this. So ensuring those things has now helped navigate those systemic barriers. Perhaps sometimes it's a long battle. It's 2 steps forward, 5 steps backwards sometimes, but that's just the game we play.
Thank you, Mitul. So can you share an impactful moment or initiative from your work that demonstrates the power of community, if you can?
Yeah, the big one that comes to mind is the Rage Against Rape protests, right? That only came about because a bunch of us feminist activists across generations, so feminists across generations gets born, and all we want to do is rage. We have, the world doesn't make space for feminine rage. Feminine rage is generally, people don't like women angry, and especially racialized women, right? We all know the trope of the angry Black woman and Arab women being too loud. Like, we just always want women to be silenced. So we came together collectively. We want to scream. We're angry at this. We're frustrated, but we're infuriated. And creating that space, that safe space together, and moving towards that collective, that action that we took, all the protests, the marches, and alongside that, the policy interventions that we had planned and executed, I think really shows that community-driven and community-based action, that collective action, something that started in the streets of Brazil, right? The rapist is you, the rapist in you. We were performing that on Taka streets. So to me, that really shows that in that the first moment, the first time we did one of our flash mobs, is and we translated that, right? The rapist is you in Bangla. So that even felt even deeper for us. So I think I'm still like get goosebumps when I talk about some of those flash mobs and some of our marches and our big parliament protest and all of that. Like, nothing can take away that the power of community and the power of sisterhood. And when I say sisterhood, I don't mean just like, oh, just cis women, like sisterhood as a concept, and how we all came together as a collective to fight for that. And then in my work with Swayong, obviously, always I've experienced firsthand, like seen that change. Their eyes now glisten a little bit differently after having told us their stories. And oh, that can heal anybody. That can soothe even the hardest of hearts, I think. So like those impacts, the impact of those moments, I think are really why I do what I do. And the ripple effects of that keep me going. And finally, another one is when I used to work for Manushya Janma Foundation, I was managing the nationwide campaign called Equality Through Dignity. So back then, we actually also worked with a lot of women farmers, like rural women farmers, to do a research plus also just community-based work on calculating how much unpaid agricultural work, like we talk about unpaid care work, unpaid household work, right? I remember that work being unpaid agricultural work that they do and how they navigate those systems and how the systems in place are only creating more barriers for them. And when we worked with them to kind of find solutions and get that represented and taken to the parliament for discussion, I think is also something, another moment that I hold very, very deeply in my heart, and just like all the little things that I've done. That those three, I think, would have to be my biggest highlights.
Thank you, Mitul, and thank you so much for your courage and your work. You have done so much and doing so much for us. We're really grateful to have a feminist like you. Okay, so as someone working in equity, diversity, and inclusion, how do you see these frameworks influencing feminist movements today?
In the current global context, especially what's happening where you are and what's happening in my neighbors, EDI and DEI, however you say it, without that, we would only have, as I see from my feminist perspective, we would only have white feminism, right? We wouldn't have feminism for South Asian women. We wouldn't have feminism for Turkish women. We wouldn't have feminism for Iranian women. We wouldn't have Black feminism. We wouldn't have any of that without EDI frameworks being embedded into the feminist movements today, right? Because in the pursuit of justice, if you don't think about equity, if you don't think about who's privileged, who's not, how do we redistribute power? If you don't start thinking about what is anti-racism, what is anti-oppression, how are the systems in place, how are they oppressive? And when we think about oppression, we just think, oh, slavery is abolished. The British have left India. So who's oppressing who anymore? The systems they left behind, the systems they continue to create, perpetuate the 200-year-long oppression and continue to do so, right? And we would not be able to decolonize any of that without embracing EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, justice, belonging into our feminist movement. These frameworks are actually what pushes the feminism movement to become more intersectional, right? Feminism embraced when we say women, and now it's women identifying, women and gender diverse, women and gender non-binary. Feminism was able to embrace all of those identities from just the binary man woman that we maybe came up with in the 60s. And it was only possible because of the equity, diversity, inclusion framework and looking at it from an anti-oppression, anti-racism perspective and embedding all of that into our work, because otherwise we would just fall into the traps of white saviorism, right? We would fall into the traps of white colonial superpowers kind of guiding and leading all of that work. And I think the EDI frameworks allow us to question and challenge those existing systems and existing narratives. And they also honestly create a more inclusive space for all the groups that I just talked about. For example, women living with disabilities or genderqueer folks living with disabilities is something that's only been able to now embrace into the larger feminist movement because of disability, diversity and inclusion. Otherwise, we would have had a group of cisgendered white women, able-bodied, right, middle class, and we would not be able to break down any of those or question the privileges and the system of privileges around those things without embracing and embedding of EDI framework.
Thank you. Also, we will need to like address that uh what do you say, like IED or like ID
Yeah, DEI is diversity,
DEI
equity,
here, like you
inclusion.
said. Okay, so white women also benefit from DEI. Okay, we also
No,
need to have,
everybody does.
yeah,
Everybody does.
absolutely, yes.
And that's like, I think the case for EDI is that,
Yeah.
you know, you people keep putting merit versus EDI as if those are contradicting terms, as if they need to be mutually exclusive. They're not. The frameworks of equity, diversity, inclusion do not ever suggest that they are contrary to one another, that one cannot exist where the other is. That is never the case. So even those in positions of power and privilege benefit from embracing equity, diversity, inclusion, because it's not replacing powers. What it does is it redistributes powers. It's in addition to, it's yes and, not no but, right? It's yes and. So yes, white feminists and Black feminists and brown feminists and disabled feminists. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And those were only possible because of the frameworks of equity, diversity, inclusion, because of the frameworks of intersectionality, because of the frameworks of anti-oppression, anti-racism, and all of the, power privilege discussions, which all happen under these similar frameworks.
Yeah. Now I made that comment because of like right now people are trying to like to say that this is a really race thing, that like all the time DEE benefits the mostly the person of color people, which is a false narrative. That's why I kind of like, like white women also get benefit from DEI, right?
I'll give you an
And
example.
yeah.
White men have benefited from EDI frameworks because a lot of, I mean, they might not like to hear it, but a lot of, like, for example, take America's example, a lot of the veterans who were given jobs after they came back from the wars were affirmative action hires, right? They were given that opportunity because of this particular circumstances that they've suffered under, or they've had to endure pain and loss because of, that situation. They were later given affirmative action. So the veterans that may now think, oh, put merit against EDI, also forget that white cisgendered men have also benefited from equity, diversity, inclusion.
Thank you so much for clearing that up, Mitul. And I really appreciate your work related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Keep doing that. So, so what do you think? What do you think are the biggest opportunities and challenges for feminist activism in both local and global contexts?
One of the biggest opportunities, and I'm so happy to say this, is increasing global solidarity among women, women identifying gender diverse groups, and other systemically marginalized groups. And that has led to such great visibility and collective action. The example I gave earlier, right? The protest in Brazil, now taking place in Dhaka in Bangla, is just an example of that. Or the women in Iran who were arrested for not dressing a certain way, and they had to face the abuse, the trauma, the torture, and all of that followed. And the global solidarity, the global collective action that now takes place is something that historically it was only happening in pockets, or it only impacted smaller countries. But now we see Women's March happened in Dhaka, so then there was a Women's March in Pakistan, right? Like we see those the chain reaction of these, the collective action, the global solidarity of these groups. I think it's unforeseen, right? I think it's historically is one of the most solidarity giving situation that I've seen in the global feminist space right now. So that has to be the connectivity that we feel, the solidarity that we share is, I think, one of the biggest opportunities where we're speaking for one another. Women facing gender apartheid in Afghanistan are now people sitting in Canada or America are fighting for them, raising their voice for them. So that level of solidarity did not exist in the past, and it really is a big opportunity for us right now. On the other hand, a challenge is the backlash. While, that grows, we know how in both local and global contexts, with conservative movements gaining traction, we know that these will further push back and push for the rollback of like women's rights. Right? We saw what happened with Roe versus Wade. We saw what's happening with abortion rights across several states in the US. We're seeing what's happening, Afghanistan falling under the rule of Taliban once again, and the gender apartheid that's taking place. So there's that rise in populism, rise in conservative movements that are taking us back as well. So that I think right now would be one of the biggest challenges that face our collective, like global movement of feminism and gender activism. But I think another challenge would also, like I always talk about it, and I've talked about it here many times, is intersectionality. Ensuring that feminist activism is inclusive of all, like genders, really, whatever you identify as, whatever your race, religion, background, education, socioeconomic class, all of that might be. I think really embracing, your levels of ability, your physical, mental disabilities, and all of that. I think we're getting there. We're just talking about it. But because some of those groups are so removed from the traditional networks, from the traditional tables where these conversations are happening, that it is really difficult and it's a challenge to make them included, make them feel included in these conversations. And I don't mean just tokenistic, we invited one person from that group. I mean where they feel a sense of belonging with the movement. So I think that's also a challenge that we have to overcome.
Thank you, Mitul. Um, so how do you think advocacy and policy work can better support feminist goals and create sustainable change?
And the first one is that advocacy must center around the voices and the stories of the most impacted by gender inequality. Ensuring that policy solutions or policy, recommendations are rooted in real lived or living experiences. And because we've seen in the past, right, we tend to impose solutions because of how the powers work. Is somebody on top makes a decision, so we take it to the community and shove it down the community's throat. we can't we can't do that. That system hasn't worked. That system is not sustainable. That has failed over and over again. So it's time for us to really include those voices and those people with living and lived experiences to take part in policy actions and policy formations, like from the very beginning of any advocacy policy work, because nobody knows their situation, their communities, their challenges better than them. And I think it's also important to create policies that are not just reactive. Like, don't just change the rape laws because there's people on the streets protesting, but you should also be proactive about creating policies where you can address the root causes of gender injustice or also other social injustices than just the symptoms. And that goes for domestic violence, right? We always see domestic violence policies being very like post situation, post incident centered. How do you report it? How do you go to the, law enforcement? What's the part work of the law enforcement after? How do you, protect the evidence? But we need to move further back instead of just addressing the symptoms of the issue, like go back to the cause. What is causing people to act that way, to commit that level of violence, and to do all of those things? So I think policymakers really need to take a step back and look deeper when they're developing these solutions, and advocacy people, like advocates as well, like myself and others, should also, instead of just focusing on the aftermath of these things, should really start thinking where do they come from and how can we address it in the roots of it. And I think another aspect would be like how can policy better support, would be policies and policymakers can really support collaborations between grassroots organizations, policymakers, private sector. And I think this type of multilateral collaboration is crucial for ensuring that these policies are not only just implemented, like they're just passed. No, but they have to be effective, they have to be sustainable, and they have to be equitable. And in order for that to happen, we need to have all parties present in drafting them.
Thank you, Mitul. So looking back on your journey, what lessons have you learned that you would like to pass on to younger feminists and advocates?
I think I'll say three things. I'm not sure if my advice is valuable or how you take it, but I think the first one is that persistence is key and change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward counts. So, like the women's marches in the 60s, and we're still doing them. So we continue to do it, we continue to push. And sometimes you might get stuck in thinking, oh, the things I'm fighting for, I won't see the change in my lifetime. But in those moments, remember that your grandmothers crawled so you could walk. So we are walking so that the people that come after us can run. And to find pleasure and to find fulfillment in knowing that because you walked today, somebody who comes 40 years after you would be able to run. So keep persisting and not to get disheartened when change is slow or change feels impossible, because it's still the tectonic plates are still shifting. They're just really big, so we don't always feel it, like the Earth's rotation. And secondly, I would say, don't be afraid to question the status quo. I feel like that's just my life motto at this point, like rebel with any cause. I would rather be rebel with any cause than rebel with no cause. So ask the tough questions, always challenge the status quo. And feminism and feminist movement, regardless of how you identify yourself with this term, feminism is always about questioning the systems that perpetuate inequity, regardless of what aspect. And finally, though, I do want to say that this work is hard. This work is exhausting. It's exhausting emotionally, spiritually, physically. So it's very important that you take care of yourself as you continue to advocate for others, because something I always tell everybody that I meet is that you cannot pour from an empty jug. So you have to make sure that your own jug is full so that you can pour for others. And remember that self-care is resistance. Fighting back against colonial capitalist systems that drain the life out of you, and resting and taking care of yourself is an authentic form of resistance. And I want you to remember that.
Thank you so much, Mitul. So, what is your vision for the future of feminism and social justice, especially in addressing gender inequalities globally and in Bangladesh?
I think my vision is where feminist movements are fully intersectional, where Bengali feminists include indigenous feminists in their conversations, where able-bodied feminists include, women with disabilities or people with disabilities in their conversations, where white feminism includes racialized feminism into their conversations. I really want to see feminism and gender equity and social justice work become truly, truly intersectional, where equality and talks about justice is not just a distant dream, but a lived reality for all, regardless of however many identities you come with. In Bangladesh specifically, I hope to see a shift towards more inclusive and equitable policies that support women and systemically marginalized groups in accessing even the basics of human rights, such as education, healthcare, economic opportunities, livelihoods, and ensuring that equal participation is happening not through force or necessity, but through active participation of all. So I think specifically in Bangladeshi context, you create jobs for women and suddenly husbands of certain, we know so many of these stories, right? That they're sending the wives off to work and then they become drunkards themselves. And like the whole system gets exploited. And then you start hearing about, oh, this is all happening because of women empowerment. And I want to start like Bangladesh to shift that narrative. Like seriously, like it's time for us to shift away from that and invite and make space for authentic participation of women and all genders folks into accessing these basic networks, these basic resources, and this basic, pursuit of happiness, if you may. That they should be able to do all of those things. And on a global scale, what I really would like to see is women's rights being enshrined in international policies as a priority, honestly. We've been talking about it for way too long, and it keeps getting sidelined. Like we've heard for so long that we've heard at least since 2020, the pandemic, where global gender-based violence was declared a global epidemic, right? And it was declared a global crisis. But then nothing happened. Like what did we do with that information, right? Like we're not treating this epidemic the way that we collectively came together globally to deal with a pandemic. So I feel like we've sidelined it once again because we always tend to like deprioritize women's rights, gender rights, minority rights, and inclusion. So I would really like the international community and the international policymakers, and that would be like a great vision. And I would love to kind of like that would make me really happy, and my work would be done, and I can retire. But we'll see how distant that dream is for now.
Yeah, we just can imagine or also hope for that, right? So, is there a particular story or memory from your work that you would like to share to encapsulate your journey?
So this story, I almost feel bad for ending on such a dark note or getting to this point of our conversation. But I would like to give you and the listeners a bit of trigger warning is that the story I'm about to share does contain references to child sexual exploitation, child sexual assault, and just some other aspects of children, violence against children. So this was when I was teaching in a very underserved community. And this is in my very early 20s. So I'm very young and naive and still disillusioned, I guess, about how the world is. And I was teaching in a classroom of, 65, 70, very little children. And during that time, one thing led to another. So the story is we saw two of our students one day buying biryani for lunch. And this is how community is so important, right? Knowing the context. One of the other teachers who'd been teaching there for much longer than I have made me question that. She's like, how are they buying biryani for lunch? Like, this is an underserved community, right? So biryani is an expensive commodity, and it automatically makes you think, what's happening? Is it someone's birthday? Whose parents? Like, what, even the parents wouldn't be able to afford this type of lunch all the time. So what is happening? And then we saw it another day. So it was like multiple days in the same week where we saw some children, some of our girl students eating biryani for lunch. And I never thought, I didn't know to question that. I'm like, it's right there. And to me, my idea of expensive, like I said, I was very disillusioned from who I was and where I am in that time. Definitely my idea of the teacher questioning that and her wheels turning didn't really make sense to me. So then that started an entire process of investigation among all the female teachers in the school. And I was thinking, we're not involving some of the other, male teachers in this. Like this became like this conversation. And slowly we uncovered that there was the dark truth of some of our primary school kids being involved and being used and exploited in a prostitution ring. And yes, you heard me right. Like this is primary school children. And how that unraveled and us coming to find out about who was involved. And then it was a community issue. And we also were able to identify kind of like the hub outside the school where this was happening. And that like the interventions that we took at that time, I think a lot of people would have liked us to just close the doors, lock the gates of the school during lunchtime. And that wouldn't be a good solution because that's not sustainable. The school playground or the school grounds didn't have enough water, didn't have enough bathrooms to support, lunch is always at the same time for everybody. Who's going to go where? So we just didn't have the resources within the school premises to support a proper healthy environment during that lunchtime for everybody. And at the same time, when we let them out, this was what was waiting for them on the outsides, right outside that gate. And with community, this is like the power of community. The teachers got together, spoke to the mosque that was right across our school. We shut down that hub that was kind of like an arcade game center where a lot of children went during lunchtime, during recess, during lunchtime anyway. So the community really came together and shut that down and made sure that children were not like they didn't have access to that space and and those other people didn't have access to the children. And the mosque agreed to open up the doors during lunchtime to allow kids to go to the bathroom there, to drink water there. some of the buildings nearby the school premises they also opened up, like they can, use the bathrooms here, they can come in and eat in the garage here. So the way that the community worked together and opened up and collectively without, and this is what was the most surprising, right? We always blame and we always were so quick to judge that, oh, they must have blamed these kids and they must have shamed these children, but they didn't. They were scared for them. They came together for them. And maybe that has to do with a little bit of how the school teachers, we got together and educated. And we used to do a lot of community service at that time. We used to do a lot of community visits, even though we were teachers, but we did a lot of community visits. So most of the parents and the shop owners and all of them knew us, like the teachers personally almost, and they knew our faces. So that continuous trust building that we had been doing all along, that sometimes I felt like, why am I even doing this? Answered themselves in, whatever I needed and then some. And to me, that journey, like that story, that incident of, and how the children were recruiting other children within the school, and like what the layers were just kind of as the whole thing unraveled. I feel like when I think about that specific journey and my few weeks of when we were addressing that, is really just how my journey now looks like. Being a little judgy and then questioning my judgment, learning, unlearning, deconstructing, reaching out to the people for their solutions, their unique needs. Like, because most people would just say, shut the doors. We didn't want to closed off. We wanted to let people in. We wanted to integrate. And the community will surprise you with their power of collective. And like, I really carry that how long has it been? It's been a long, long time. It's been at least a decade since I think that experience and that story. And I always carry all the lessons and all the things that happened during that time throughout like my journey. And it really encapsulates who I became, who I was in the beginning of this work and who I am at the end of it and who I have been throughout. I think like I think that incident and that going through that experience is how I try to look at my work now. And another small story I cannot not talk about, which is a positive one. I'm going to end on a positive because that was very dark and depressing, is that the launch of Swayong, I think, is something that still it makes me smile. It makes me think of it's a growth. It's a little bud that grew from nothing, from just a little thought in my sister and my head, and seeing that firsthand impact on those who had been able to share their stories. I would sometimes go and check out like our campaigns on the Swayong website or the Swayong Facebook pages and go see like the first campaigns that we did from almost 5 years ago at this point, and how that thought became an action and that action became impact is also something that I draw inspiration from throughout my journey. And I continue to try to look back and take the joys and the bads, all of that together as part of my journey.
Thank you so much for sharing both of the stories. Like, yeah, a slightly negative one and slightly positive one, but I'm still very petrified hearing that first story. It will it will take some time for me to like to process it, but thank you so much for doing that courageous work. That's what we have to do, right? We have to also to like to work for the people who cannot work for themselves, right? So that a little bit encouragement can also create a change in the society, right? So thank you so much for doing that work, Mitul. You should be very proud of yourself, and we are very much proud of ourselves to have a Bangladeshi feminist like you. We need more Bangladeshi feminists like you in our region. Do you have any concluding remarks to share if you want?
It's Thank you. Thank you. You say such wonderful things. The imposter syndrome in me can hardly handle all the wonderful things you're saying. I hope that I'm just a drop in this ocean of feminist movement and the movement to justice. what you were talking about, as I continue to do the work for those who cannot do the work themselves, I feel like the way that I see is I want to build and break down systems and rebuild them in a way where I don't have to anymore. My vision is for me to eradicate my role, where I don't have to exist. I want a world where Mituls and Onoys don't have to do this work. Well, that's we've made it, and yeah, I want to become obsolete. Make my work obsolete.
I do echo with you, really, Mitul. And huh, such a great conversation, Mitul. Such a great
Thank you.
conversation. I really, really appreciate your opening up to us, right? Like you're opening yourself up to us, and like you shared so many inspiring stories and anecdotes with us. I'm really, really grateful to have you here. Mitul, thank you so much for sharing your journey, your insights, and your inspiring work with us today. Your dedication to gender equality, social justice, and community-driven advocacy is a testament to the power of empathy, equity, and action. As part of the Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project, your voice will serve as a vital resource for future generations, inspiring them to continue the fight for justice and equality. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel of the Bangladesh Feminist Archives and do check Shoyong's website and their Facebook, LinkedIn, and also the amazing works they are doing right now. Stay tuned for more conversations with feminists shaping history and the future of Bangladesh. Thank you again, Mitul, and thank you all for being part of this journey.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.